Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. I had always enjoyed camping alone. It was just a way for me to clear my mind, get away from the noise of the city, and be alone with my thoughts for a bit. The plan was simple: find a quiet spot in the California wilderness, set up my tent by the river, and just be. I'd been to the area a few times before, so I knew it well. But that night was different. I had arrived around noon, a perfect day for setting up camp. The river was flowing steadily, and the weather was mild, no sign of rain. The trees were thick, the kind that made you feel like you were swallowed up by nature. I loved that feeling. I set up my tent by the riverbank, unpacked my gear, and started a small fire. The crackling of the flames was calming, and the world around me felt peaceful, untouched. I spent the afternoon fishing, just killing time, enjoying the solitude. I didn't expect anyone to pass by. This part of the forest wasn't exactly a popular spot, and I was far enough off the beaten path that no one would stumble upon me unless they were specifically looking. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I gathered some firewood and sat down by the fire, watching the sky turn dark. I felt that familiar sense of peace settle in. There was something about being in the woods completely alone that made everything else feel distant. My thoughts wandered a bit about life, work, relationships, all the usual stuff. Night fell and the air grew colder. The fire helped, but it wasn't enough to chase away the chill entirely. I climbed into my tent, zipping it up tight and lying down on my sleeping bag. I couldn't have been more comfortable. No rush to be anywhere. I dozed off fairly quickly, lulled by the sounds of the river, but then something woke me up. It was a rustling noise, faint at first, but unmistakable. It came from outside the tent. My first thought was that it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer, but the rustling sounded too deliberate, too human. My heart started to pound as I listened more intently, trying to make out the sound. The rustling continued and it was moving closer. I tried to brush it off as nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the tent's fabric. Nothing. The light reflected back in strange angles, making the shadows outside seem darker, deeper. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, waiting. The rustling stopped. For a long while, everything was quiet again, but I couldn't fall back asleep. I was on edge now. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I convinced myself it was probably just a hiker or camper who had lost their way. Still, the thought of someone being out there in the woods, alone with me, made my stomach twist. Then the worst thing happened. I woke up again, but this time I wasn't alone. A cold pressure was against my throat, a sharp metal point, a knife. It was right there, pressing into my skin. My eyes snapped open, my breath catching in my throat as I tried to process what was happening. "Don't move," a voice whispered. It was low, gruff, and it sent a cold chill down my spine. I couldn't see the man, but I could feel his presence. He was there, inches away from me, close enough to touch, and that knife was still pressed into my neck. I didn't dare make a sound, afraid that if I did, he might do something worse. The only sound I could hear was the steady flow of the river outside the tent. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion, but my heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. "Where's your phone?" he whispered again. I could barely think, but my hands, without my mind even giving them the command, reached for my pocket and pulled out my phone. I handed it to him, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. "Money," he hissed. I fumbled in my backpack, heart pounding in my chest as I grabbed my wallet and handed it over. My mind was screaming, telling me to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. He took it without a word, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my breath and the steady hum of the river. I couldn't even hear him breathing. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Finally, he spoke again. "Get up," he said, the command cold and final. I did as I was told, trying to keep my movements slow and deliberate, praying that if I followed his orders, he wouldn't hurt me. I crawled out of the tent and stood on shaky legs. The night was pitch black, the fire long extinguished, leaving the forest in total darkness. He was behind me now, his footsteps soft, but I could feel his presence. The knife was still in his hand, and I could hear it faintly scrape against something, maybe his pants leg, as he walked. "Walk. Don't look back," he ordered. I started walking, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I couldn't stop. My legs were stiff like they didn't belong to me. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. Any plan, but there was nothing. The man didn't speak again, and I could barely hear his footsteps behind me, just the quiet night and the thudding of my heart. I don't know how far I walked, but after what felt like hours, I saw a flicker of light in the distance, headlights of a car. But when I turned, he was gone. Just like that. Vanished into the night. I don't know how I made it back to the road, but I somehow did. By the time I reached the nearest town, I was exhausted, shaken, and terrified out of my mind. I tried reporting it to the police, but they never found him. It felt like I was the only one who knew the truth, that there was a man out there somewhere who could have killed me, but didn't. For reasons I'll never understand, he let me go. I've never camped alone again. I don't know who he was or why he chose me, but one thing's for sure. I'll never set up a tent by a river again, not in those woods, because who knows who might be out there, waiting. This happened about 2 years ago. I was hiking alone in the Sierra Nevada. I've been hiking there for years and knew the trails well enough, but something felt off this time. It was mid-afternoon when I set out, and the sun was hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows between the trees. The air was thick with that damp, earthy smell that fills your lungs when you're deep in the forest. I liked that smell. It made me feel like I was far from the chaos of the world. I had been hiking for about 3 hours when I started to hear a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal, but it wasn't. It was a scream, a distant scream. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, a man's voice. I froze. I thought, it's probably someone just goofing off, maybe messing around with a friend. But then I heard it again, this time more desperate. It sounded like someone was really in trouble. I checked my phone, no signal. I had no choice but to follow the sound. I've hiked this area countless times, and I knew there were some remote campsites nearby, so I figured maybe someone had gotten hurt or lost. I pushed through the thick brush, following the sound as best as I could. The trees were tall and dense, and I kept tripping on the uneven ground, but the scream kept driving me forward. It didn't sound like someone in pain. It was like they were pleading, but in a way that made my skin crawl. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. The path started to narrow, and I could swear I saw something moving in the distance, a figure. It was just a silhouette, barely visible through the trees, but it didn't move like any person I've ever seen. It was too smooth, too deliberate. I wasn't sure whether to approach or call out. Something told me to keep going, that I had to find whoever was in trouble. But then I stepped forward, and I felt a tight, sharp tug at my foot. I tripped hard, falling flat on my face, and for a moment I thought I'd broken my ankle. My heart was pounding, and I could taste blood in my mouth. But then I looked around to see what had caused me to fall. A rope. It was a thick, strong rope stretched right across the path. It was hidden beneath a few branches, camouflaged perfectly. Someone had set it up deliberately. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been waiting for me to step right into their trap. I barely had time to process what was happening before I heard a low noise from behind me. A crunch of leaves. A footstep. I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest. There, walking toward me, was a man. He was tall, dressed in a dark, weathered jacket, like he'd been out there for a long time. His face was obscured by a hood, but I could see enough to know that something wasn't right. His movements were deliberate, like he was in control of the entire situation. And in his hands, he held something long, too long to be a branch. The panic hit me all at once. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt frozen. My thoughts were racing. Why hadn't I heard him approach? How had he gotten so close without making a sound? I pushed myself up, my ankles screaming in pain, but I forced myself to take a step back. That's when I saw it. On the ground, just in front of me, was a pile of strange, twisted knots. It looked like some sort of trap, or maybe something worse. The man took another step closer, his movements slow and methodical. It was like he was enjoying this, like he was savoring my fear. I couldn't think. I couldn't even scream. It was like my voice was stuck in my throat. But I knew one thing. I had to get out of there. I turned and bolted. My foot screamed in pain with each step, but I didn't care. I ran through the woods, crashing through branches, tripping over roots, not daring to look back. Every few seconds I would hear a snap of a twig or a distant rustle, like he was still following me, but I didn't dare to stop and check. It felt like I ran for miles, but in reality it was probably only a few minutes. My heart was pounding, my breathing shallow, my legs felt like lead. And then I saw it, a break in the trees, the trail that led back to the main road. I couldn't stop myself from running toward it. I reached the clearing, gasping for breath, and looked back. There was no one. The woods were silent again. I was alone, or so I thought. I hobbled back to my car as fast as I could, my heart still racing. The entire time I was driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that man in the woods following me, but there was nothing. I haven't gone back to those woods since. It's been 2 years, and I still don't know who that man was or why he was there. But one thing I do know, someone was waiting for me that day. Someone who knew exactly where I would be, who knew exactly what I would do. And I'll never forget the feeling that I wasn't just a random hiker to him. I was part of something bigger, something much darker. It was a cool, damp evening when I left my friend's cabin in the mountains. The kind of night where the air feels heavy and the fog rolls in like a silent predator, swallowing everything in its path. I was tired, but not exhausted, just enough to feel the weight of the day pressing on my shoulders. The clock on my dashboard read 10:07 p.m. Not too late, but late enough for the back roads to be eerily quiet. I don't usually take that route through the forest, but the main highway was closed for construction, and the detour signs pointed me toward the winding, narrow road that cut through the woods. I figured it'd be quicker. I figured wrong. The road was desolate, the kind of place where you might not see another car for miles. The trees loomed on either side, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the faint glow of my headlights. The fog was thick, clinging to the windshield and blurring the edges of the road. I drove slowly, my hands tight on the wheel, trying to avoid the potholes that dotted the asphalt. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the hum of my engine and the occasional crunch of gravel beneath my tires. At first, everything seemed normal, just another quiet drive through the woods. But then, about 30 minutes in, I saw her. She was standing at the side of the road, her figure barely visible through the fog. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a deer or a shadow cast by the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. Her dress was torn and dirty, the fabric hanging off her thin frame like it had been through hell. Her hair was wild, tangled, and matted, framing a face that was pale and gaunt. She was waving her arms, her movements frantic but silent, as if she were trying to flag me down without making a sound. I slowed the car, my heart starting to race. I know what you're thinking. Why would I stop for a stranger on a deserted road in the middle of nowhere? But something about her felt off. Not just her appearance, but the way she stood there, her eyes locked on my car, her mouth moving as if she were whispering something I couldn't hear. I couldn't just drive past her. What if she was in trouble? What if she needed help? I pulled over a little ahead of her, my tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. My heart was pounding now, a mix of fear and curiosity. I rolled down my window and called out, "Hey, are you okay?" She didn't respond. She just kept waving, her movements growing more frantic. I leaned forward about to shout again when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. From the trees behind her, two men emerged. They weren't running, but they were moving quickly, their figures dark and shadowy against the fog. They stayed close to the tree line, their faces obscured, but the way they moved sent a chill down my spine. They were dressed in dark, tattered clothing, their hands hanging at their sides like they were ready for something. One of them said something, his voice low and guttural, but I couldn't make out the words. The tone was enough. It was threatening, predatory. That's when it hit me. This was a setup. My stomach dropped. I glanced back at the woman, who was now stepping toward my car, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her face was expressionless, her eyes hollow and empty. The men were closer now, their shadows stretching across the road. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I slammed the car into gear and floored it, the tires screeching as I sped away. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the wheel. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, pulling into the first gas station I saw. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't report it, not right away. I told myself it was just some crazy people trying to scare me, or maybe rob me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The way the woman had looked at me, the way the men had appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't random. It was calculated, and it wasn't the first time they'd done it. A week later, I was having drinks with a friend who'd lived in the area for years. I don't know why I brought it up. Maybe I needed to talk about it to make sense of it, but I told him what had happened. His face went pale, and he set his drink down slowly, like he was afraid it might shatter. "You're lucky you didn't stop," he said, his voice low and serious. "There's a group out there. They've been pulling that same stunt for months. They set up fake distress calls, get people to pull over, and then, well, let's just say some people who stopped for them never made it home." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I thought about the woman, her hollow eyes and silent pleas. I thought about the men, their shadowy figures and threatening presence. It all made sense now. I don't drive that road anymore. I don't even like to think about it. It happened a few months ago. I've always enjoyed hiking, usually by myself. I like the solitude, the quiet, the sense of being alone with nature. It's my way of clearing my head. So, when I decided to take a solo hike in the mountains of Northern California, I thought it would be just another peaceful day in the woods. I started early, just after sunrise. The air was crisp, the sun was barely up, and the forest was still covered in a layer of mist. It felt like I had the whole place to myself, which was nice. The trail wasn't too difficult, mostly downhill for the first part, then a gradual incline. I kept a steady pace, just enjoying the quiet. After a couple of hours, I decided to stop for a break. There was a large boulder by the side of the trail, and it seemed like the perfect spot to sit and drink some water. I took out a snack, stretched my legs, and just looked out over the forest. The trees were so tall, the air smelled so fresh. Then, I saw something that made my stomach turn. At first, it was just a movement out of the corner of my eye. I didn't think much of it, assuming it was an animal. But when I glanced over, I froze. There was a man crouching in the bushes. He wasn't far from the trail, maybe 15 feet, just off to the side, hidden behind some dense undergrowth. He wasn't doing anything at first. He was just there, crouched low, and staring at me. I couldn't see his face very clearly, but his posture was strange, almost unnatural, like he was waiting for something. My first instinct was to assume it was another hiker, maybe someone who got a little lost or was taking an odd rest. But something about it didn't sit right with me. He didn't have a backpack. He wasn't moving like someone who was out for a hike. He just watched me. I kept my gaze fixed on him, trying to figure out what was going on. It's not like I could call out to him. He didn't seem like he was going to respond. It was like I wasn't supposed to notice him, but I did. I don't know why, but I felt like I shouldn't be there. That's when I heard him. At first, it was so quiet that I wasn't sure I heard anything at all. Just a soft sound like someone mumbling under their breath. I thought maybe I was imagining it, but then it came again. Low. Drawn out. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely him. The man in the bushes. The mumbling wasn't clear, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a voice you'd hear from someone who was lost or confused. It sounded almost familiar, but not in a good way. Like the person was trying to speak but couldn't form real words. Like they were muttering to themselves in a way that made no sense. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. I don't know why. I knew I should have stood up and walked away, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the fact that his voice was so low and strange, or maybe it was the way he wasn't reacting to me at all. He was completely still crouched, but his eyes, those eyes, were locked on me. He kept mumbling, though the words still didn't make sense. It was like he was speaking in a language I couldn't understand, or like he was saying something over and over that I couldn't quite catch. The tone never changed, just this low, unsettling sound, like someone lost in their own world but watching me. I started to get that feeling. You know the one. The cold feeling that crawls up your spine and tells you that something's wrong. That feeling that doesn't go away until you've left. And that's exactly what I did. Slowly, I stood up, trying not to make a sound, but my heart was racing. I turned away from him, just a little, trying to make it seem like I wasn't panicking. I needed to keep it together, I told myself. But the second I moved, I heard him stand up, too. His movement was quick, almost too fast, and then I heard it again. His mumbling, louder now. Not clearer, just louder, like he was talking to himself, but also to me. The tone was still the same, low and garbled, like he was stuck in his own head. I didn't wait. I didn't think about it. I turned and started walking faster, then broke into a jog. My feet hit the rocky ground hard as I tried to put as much distance between me and that thing in the bushes. I didn't dare look back. I could hear him moving, though, footsteps, rustling leaves, but no words, just that low mumbling. It was the kind of sound that made every part of me scream to run faster. I couldn't focus on anything but getting away. I slipped on a loose rock, scraped my hand on the jagged edges of another, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. The more I ran, the faster the mumbling seemed to come. It was like he was right behind me, though I didn't dare look back. I finally reached the edge of the trail, near the clearing where the path led back to the parking lot. I saw my car in the distance, and it gave me a burst of energy I didn't know I had left. I didn't even slow down until I was at the car, fumbling with my keys, barely able to get the door open. Once I was inside, I locked the doors and just sat there, shaking. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know who that man was or why he was out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just lost. I checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me from the edge of the woods. But there was nothing. I haven't gone back to those trails since, and every time I think about it, I can't stop hearing that mumbling. Low, indistinct, like something I wasn't meant to understand. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe it wasn't anything serious, but I can't shake the feeling that there was something off about that man. Something wrong. So, if you ever go hiking alone in the woods, just remember, sometimes when you think you're alone, you're not. And sometimes it's the things you can't understand that are the most dangerous. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.